Hi, good afternoon. I am Samer Atallah. I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research at the AUC School of Business. I'm also an Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics. Thank you all for coming today to another panel discussion that the school and the Department of Economics conducts in collaboration with the International Monetary Fund office in Egypt. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for our guests from outside the campus for making it all the way to New Cairo on a Thursday afternoon. That's very much appreciated. Before we start the panel, I want to invite Saeed Bakhash, who is the IMF senior representative in Egypt, to give his introductory remarks before we start the panel. So Saeed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Samer. I have to say for Roberto and Suchanan on the screen, I'm not sure whether you can see the audience, but if you're worried about gender equality and gap, I think you'll be very happy to be in the room here and see that a very good majority of the audience are women. So this is just as an observation related to an item that matters for inclusive growth. But first, a real pleasure to be at the American University in Cairo. Thank you all and welcome to this event. This is an event that discusses inclusive growth in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I have to say it is perhaps one of the most important, perhaps most consequential topics for the future of the region, especially given the youthful population in our countries. I should start by expressing my appreciation to the Business School of AUC, and of course its Dean, Dr. Sharif Kamel, and very importantly, Dr. Samer Atallah. Thank you so much for helping us with this actually lifting this whole event. So thank you for partnering with us. Mr. Ahmed, Abdel Wahab, thank you very much for agreeing to come, take time and share your expert views. I look forward to hearing you. And of course, we're grateful for all of you who are joining us today. Now, let me give you a context for what this event is. This event is part of a series of activities organized by the IMF titled The Road to Marrakesh. This is what the fund does in this context is it collaborates with local institutions and member countries and conducting events and seminars like this one to discuss relevant issues and pave the way for the discussions that are planned to take place in Marrakesh for the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF in October 2023. One of the key themes of this year's annual meeting is building resilience and promoting inclusive growth. Of course, issues related to the youth are integral to the reform agenda in this regard. Whether it's building human capital, fostering opportunities for innovation, or encouraging job creation. These are at the heart of what matters. So you may or may not know that the IMF has developed a tradition of engaging with young people in the region, around the world, but in the region in particular, to share views, but also to hear insights about the economic and social challenges that our countries are facing. So this event is, of course, to hear our colleagues from the IMF, the panelists, but also to hear your views and questions and concerns. I do want to use this event to encourage you all to apply to what we call the IMF Young Fellowship Program. This is a capacity building program that provides the opportunity to young leaders from across the world, in this case in Egypt, to join the IMF. Yes, the slide is here, thank you. At the forefront of the discussions and efforts underway to deal with the global economic challenges. Selected participants will be sponsored by the IMF to to experience firsthand the IMF World Bank annual meetings in Marrakesh and attend in person a workshop that is led by IMF management, senior staff, but also external experts to discuss matters that are important and critical for the global economic outlook. The application criteria are on the slide. I will perhaps note a few of them, but this is obviously for university age students, 20 to 35. It would be good to show that you have demonstrated experiences in one of those areas that are highlighted on the slide. Have knowledge and expertise in international studies, basic economics, development issues, inclusive growth, climate change, digital economy. There are a number of other criteria. I won't mention them here, but they are on the slide. We have copies, hard copies of these slides outside. So please use the link imf.org/youth. If you face difficulties finding it, give us a few hours, because I realize that there's an issue with the link, but our colleagues at the IMF, Karim tells me, are working on that. So this is by way of advertising and marketing the IMF fellowship program that I really hope you will be interested in, because it is indeed a unique opportunity to see these annual meetings firsthand and in person. So let me go back to the question at hand. I want to highlight a few points about inclusive growth, including starting with what is inclusive growth and why does it matter. And it is important to note that the concept of inclusive growth is quite a bit different than the concept of economic growth and GDP growth, the way we know it and think about it, because it is more concerned about how the fruits of growth trickle down to all groups of society. So it doesn't matter that just GDP is growing, but it matters how people are affected by the growth in GDP. So it measures things like how well and sustainable an economy is performing, how cohesive and inclusive its economic and social policies are. It reflects measures of human capital, health, education, life expectancy, gender gaps, youth participation, poverty, inequality, also things related to social, political empowerment, financial inclusion. There's obviously a critical link between inclusive growth and quality job creation. As I know Roberto will highlight, the MENA region, our countries here in the region, have achieved some progress in these areas, but it's clear that they have a long way to go on pretty much all the fronts that I mentioned earlier in my remarks. Working towards more inclusive growth is not a simple task, especially for countries in the region today, where our economies are facing challenges from global shocks. They're facing limited fiscal space, and their external positions are under pressure. So these policies that are needed for inclusive growth have to come at a time when our countries have to deal with these other challenges. And I have to say, this applies to many countries in the region, but Egypt in particular. A key issue is how to promote the role of the private sector in the economy, how to move the growth model to a place where the private sector is leading and the private sector is able to create jobs, pay taxes, invest, attract FDI, attract new technologies. MENA countries have to really rethink the role of the state in the economy in a way that shifts the state from being a competitor in the business world to a player that is an enabler to the private sector, to a player that fosters a fair regulatory framework and environment to help the private sector compete in a healthy manner. Of course, you will see one of the presentation will focus on the second presentation. I think Suchanan's presentation will focus on this issue, but the first presentation and the book that is associated with this event, which is called Promoting Inclusive Growth in the Middle East and North Africa, will shed light on the policies that are needed to improve the ability of our economies to grow in an inclusive manner. The book is very rich. It's very rich in its coverage, but it's also rich in its analytics. And I really highly encourage you to read it because it is there's a lot to learn from just reading the book. Let me stop here and say thank you again to all of you for coming here. Looking forward to hear the discussion. And again, please consider applying to the fellowship program. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed, for your introductory remarks and offering and announcing the fellowships. I strongly, again, encourage the students to apply. But most importantly, Saeed, when we want the students to read something, we tell them it's in the exam. So the book is in the exam. It's a very, very rich book. I spent maybe a couple of hours going over it. I haven't read it yet fully, but I've read the important the parts that I'm interested in. It's a very, very interesting book. It's available for free on the IMF website. So I hope you'll dedicate time in the summer reading to go over it. Just a couple of logistical points before we start, if you allow me. One of our panelists, Mrs. Mona El-Kheshen, unfortunately got sick with food poisoning today, and she texted me in the morning she will not be able to join us. So it's only going to be me and Dr. Ahmed, Abdel, Wahab, and the colleagues from the IMF. Also, another logistical point, I want to acknowledge my colleague Hiba Halim in the back. She was been the dynamo in organizing the logistics. Thank you, Hiba, so much. And thank you, Saeed and Karim Badr, for helping me organize this event today with the IMF. And I have to say that this event is sponsored by Dr. Dina Abfattah, the chair of the Department of Economics. So the credit goes to who paid for everything. So I'll start first. I don't want to repeat what Saeed said. It's obviously the issue of inclusive growth in the MENA region is quite critical to this region. It's one of the essence of the chronic problems that we are facing in this region, whether regarding to youth employment, whether regarding to gender, whether regarding to the role of the private sector. And the book rightly points out to these chronic diseases that we've been knowing about this region for many, many decades. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted the need to address them very profoundly and very promptly. So I'll start by introducing the speakers. To my right is one of my dear friends, if I may, Dr. Ahmed Wahab. He is a friend of the school, not just a friend of me. He is currently the managing director of East Port Said Development Company, the national Egyptian railway industry company, and he is also the chairman of the Egypt German automotive industry. He is currently also the chair of the strategic advisory board of the AUC School of Business, and he's been constantly supporting us with a lot of activities, especially related to the students. He's also a colleague. He's an adjunct faculty in the school, and he is an engineer, so also as my background, and he has his MBA and PhD degree from business administration from the University of Alabama. Virtually, we're joined by two colleagues from the IMF, Ricardo Cardarelli. He's the assistant director for our region for the Middle East and Central Asia department. Hello, Roberto. He was the mission chief in Morocco, and before that, he worked in the Western Hemisphere of the IMF chief of the North America region, and also worked in Latin America, in Chile and Argentina. So basically, I think Ricardo knows every corner of the globe. So I'm sure he will not only talk about the MENA region, but other regions. He's an Italian national, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. Suchanan Tambunlertchai, I've been practicing this morning. I hope I said it correctly, Suchanan. She's the deputy chief of the E3 division at the IMF African department, and the mission chief for the Comoros. Prior to that area, she was the senior economist on the Egypt team and the US team, so she knows a lot about our country. She has worked on the strategy and policy review department of the European department. She's been with the IMF since 2011, and she's worked on several issues related to public debt sustainability, another issue that is close to us here. She has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and an AB from economics from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here to speak to us or spend time. I know the colleagues from IMF are waking up super early to be with us today. So I'll start with Roberto. He was kind enough to prepare for us a deck of slides, just giving us a quick overview of the key findings of the book. I'm sure he will generate interest for you guys to read it. I think it's really a blueprint of diagnosis and cure of the major issues and challenges related to our region. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everybody for being here. Indeed, I have about 15 minutes to go through the book, give you a broad overview on what the book is about. As Said said, this is not the first time the IMF writes about inclusive growth in MENA. We've done quite a lot over the years. I'll say that what remain, these issues, some of these issues remain the same, some are new, but it's always important for us as we go to the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF that this year are going to be held in Morocco, in Marrakesh, in October. It's important for us to discuss these issues because we really want to bring them to the attention of the policymakers that are going to meet in Marrakesh in October. Okay, so the book has 8 chapters. I'm going to go through the main questions, kind of give you a flavor of the main solutions. Hopefully you see the slide. The main findings, a little bit of a flavor on the methodology, but the chapters contain much more, of course. So I'm going to go just on the broad messages. Chapter 1, the question is how we measure inclusiveness. How can we assess the extent to which the region is behind or ahead relative to other regions? The second chapter is why should we matter? Why should we be interested in inclusiveness or lack of inclusiveness from a point of view of economic growth and macro stability? Chapter 3, the one that Suchanan is going to talk about, is how the presence of large state-owned enterprises affect the efficiency of the allocation of resources. Chapter 4, it's a new dimension, if you want, of inclusiveness, how the automation, artificial intelligence, and remote working can change labor market in the MENA and compound the problem or solve the problem or improve the inclusiveness dimension of growth. Chapter 5, huge, large labor market gender disparities, what's driving them in the MENA. Chapter 6, it's a chapter about social spending, the impact of higher social spending or more efficient social spending on macro indicators and human capital indicators. Chapter 7, financial inclusion, the dimension of it and the importance of lack of financial inclusion for many economies. And chapter 8, another new dimension of the problem, the impact of climate change on inclusive growth. The last 3 chapters they use a chapter version of papers that have been issued already in the past few years. The first 5 are new for the book. So first question, first chapter, how do we measure inclusiveness? So the way, as Said pointed out, the way we look at inclusiveness is essentially around 4 main dimensions. I'll say the one is benefit sharing, income inequality, wealth inequality. The second one is opportunity. Inclusiveness here means access, equal access, fair access to education, health, financial services. Participation is the third dimension, participation into economic life, job opportunities, gender inclusion, but also private sector inclusion. And the fourth dimension is empowerment, the capacity, the ability to have voice, if you want, in not only in the economic, but also in the political and social dimensions. We attach to each of these 4 dimensions a series of variables. We try to describe the 4 dimensions to a series of indicators which are on the right table of this slide, and we essentially build indexes for about 122 countries around the world, including 15 MENA economies. Essentially, we use the usual income inequality, the Gini index, the normal variables that describe access to education, enrollment, school life expectancy, and all the other charts, variables in the table on the right side. So we build this index, and this is the result. The chart on the left shows that the MENA region is indeed behind in many, if this dimension, actually in all of these dimensions relative to the rest of the world. In particular, the sub-indices where MENA lacks and lags the rest of the world the most are private sector inclusion, quality and governance, and even more gender inclusion. And the situation around the MENA countries is described on the other chart, the one on the right. Higher economy, higher income countries in MENA, the Gulf countries in particular, seems to have the best scores in the overall index, particular financial and labor market inclusion, reflecting the low unemployment rate there and the deeper financial markets, and the lower income countries like Yemen, Mauritania, Pakistan seems to lag the most, particularly again in the private sector and financial inclusion variable. Egypt is more or less around the middle of the spectrum on the right side. Chapter 2: how does lack of inclusion affect growth? Why should we matter? This is not an easy question to address from an empirical perspective. So the way that we go about this, we look at the empirics, but then we look at the general equilibrium model, where we look at the importance of lack of inclusion in terms of distortions that prevent an efficient allocation of resources. Two main type of distortions, two main type of frictions. One is product market distortions. So everything that affects market neutrality, that restrict the expansion of productive firms, we capture it as a tax imposed on firm revenues, which is especially damaging for the most productive firms, that kind of force them to operate at a smaller than optimal scale. And then financial constraint, essentially limits to access to credit. Talented entrepreneurs, they would like to set up private firms, but they lack financing. And so they are, again, constrained in the extent to which they can grow and absorb resources. This is relative to a distortion-free benchmark economy, which is calibrated as the US economy. The model is calibrated to match few characteristics of an average MENA economy. So we calibrate the model, and then on the model we run 5 different simulations. Essentially, the first one remove product market distortion, remove this tax on profits. Then we remove financial constraints. Then we remove both together. Then we assess a scenario where the policies like building infrastructure, generate an improvement in productivity, but the distortions are still there. And then the fifth scenario, when we remove the distortion in the environment, which is more dynamic, let's say, than the baseline one in which the firm's turnover rate doubles. The results are described briefly on the table on the right side. Again, if you're interested, the chapter is there for your reading, especially if this is an exam requirement. I'll just give you like a flavor of the results. As you can see in the first column, governance or product market. I mean, we call it governance, but it's product market distortion. Removing those product market distortion, removing the tax on profits, which again especially hit the most productive firms, lead to a much higher efficiency in the allocation of resources. Output increasing almost 799%. In steady state relative to the baseline. These distortions, as I said, affect the more productive firm the most. So removing them would allow these productive firms to expand, causing labor demand to increase by about 131%, and wages by about 67% relative to baseline. Higher wages in turn would drive the least productive firms outside of the market, and that explains why the number of firms fall by 54%, raising the average productivity of the remaining firms in the economy. Now, removing financial frictions, which is the column on the right, also improves economic efficiency, but a little bit less than the governance, 23% in terms of output. Now, the reason why, just to give you a flavor, is that because the existence of the first distortion, the tax on revenues, the product market distortions, kind of limit the extent to which the most productive firms can benefit from the deeper financial market, from the removal of this financial constraint. And also most productive firms are able, in a way, to circumvent this financial constraint by saving and by using self-financing. So that explains why the magnitude of the resource allocation is limited. And of course, that explains why, if you do the two together, which is the third column, the efficiency, the gains in efficiency of the allocation of resources are much stronger than by doing each of them separately. Again, I won't describe the last two columns, but you're welcome to read the chapter to understand what happens in the other two scenarios. Chapter 4, the new dimension of inclusiveness. I mean, how does the automation and remote work change the nature of work in MENA? I'm going to focus here on the automation only. Again, remote working is discussed in the chapter as well. Now, automation tend to substitute humans, people, especially in performing non-cognitive routine tasks. So countries which have a higher share of those jobs, and in a way lower skilled, are more vulnerable to automation. There's also a sectoral dimension to this. Countries that have a lot of manufacturing also are those that are more exposed. Manufacturing has a lot of occupations which involve manual and routine tasks, or used to have. I mean, maybe current manufacturing is already moving to an automated world. But also administration and middle management are exposed because they also tend to involve some cognitive but routine tasks. So in that sense, they're also exposed. And there are sectors which are less exposed because, they involve cognitive, non-routine tasks like education, healthcare, so are less likely to be affected by technological change. Now, MENA is, in a way, more exposed than other regions to this, for the obvious reason that even if there's been progress over the last 2 decades, the share of especially of middle-skilled occupations is higher, and even has increased in a way more on average in the MENA, and will remain higher than other non-MENA economies. And the share of the workforce in high skills or medium skills occupation is lower than the rest of the world. And this is the chart on the right side. This difference is particularly elevated in high-income MENA economies, which continue to rely a lot on medium skill occupation, mainly because of the prevalence of public sector jobs. So we build, does the chart do? Again, as the first one, it builds an index which captures the degree to which MENA countries are exposed, and the jobs in MENA countries are exposed to automation. The way it does it, it uses these measures of automobility, exposure of automation by occupations that have been estimated for the US. Combined with the share of those occupations by sectors, again, the share used for the US, kind of the US technologies is assumed to be the same in all the by sector, let's say. And then we construct these indexes for MENA countries by using shares of employment by sectors in MENA, in the MENA economies, to build this aggregate index. So based on this index, again, what we see that employments tend to be more exposed to automation, especially in high-income MENA economies, where again employment is more concentrated in sectors with a higher density of routine and non-cognitive tasks, like again manufacturing, construction, but also public sector jobs. Chapter 5, the biggest dimension of lack of inclusiveness, as we saw in the first slide, is gender gaps, in particular the low participation of female in the labor market in the region. The way we go about explaining why this is the case, it's regressions, cross-country regression. So essentially, we identify 6 big potential determinants of gender gaps in the labor market, like structural variables, like fertility rates, GDP per capita, infrastructure, public policies, like the tax rate, the existence of childcare, labor market legislation, maybe legislation which restrict the extent to which part-time, flexible work is feasible, which especially could benefit women. Basic legal rights, so legislations that kind of restrict women's possibility to work, but not only, I mean, also mobility, position within the households, and financial kind of rights, women's ability to access credit, to sign contracts, to open bank accounts. We use a big database built by the World Bank, the Women, Business and the Law database built by our colleagues in the World Bank. We have these panel regression frameworks, which we use to estimate and to decompose the contribution, to break down the relative contribution of these 7 variables in explaining why female labor force participation in MENA is so much lower than non-MENA regions. And what the results, in a way, unsurprisingly, my view, is that the basic and financial legal rights gaps, so gaps in those last two dimensions in the chart, in the table on the left, explain the most of the labor market gaps in the MENA, almost 80% of the gap, and then maybe followed by labor market legislation, but the existence of these gaps in basic legal and financial rights trump everything else, which again is not that surprising. You may have different, a tax system that penalizes female labor participation, but if you cannot drive your car to work, that's a little bit of a second order issue. And then the second part of the chapter use a general equilibrium model to assess, okay, if a MENA economy, which actually this model is calibrated to Egypt, by the way, because Egypt has good data, micro and macro. It's a model that it's used to answer the question on the left of this slide. what would be the macro impact if this economy, this typical MENA economy, which is happened to be Egypt in this case, were to have the same basic legal and financial gaps, gender gaps, than the average of the rest of the world. It's a model where the gender disparities are captured, essentially the gender disparities in basic legal and financial rights are captured by introducing a greater utility cost that households incur when women decide to work. So that cost acts as a disincentive for their participation into the labor market. And we kind of calibrate that cost using the results of the regression that we showed that I showed in the previous slide. So the question is, if that cost is brought to zero, what would be the impact on the macro? And the results are on the charts here on the right side of this slide. Labor force participation would increase by about 30%, between 30 and 50%, depending on the comparison with the regions. And this would trigger a series of positive effects on the economy. Since on average, women have a higher level of education than men, this greater labor force participation would increase the number of effective hours worked, which is the chart number 3 on the right, by about 7 to 10%. You increase GDP, which is the chart number 4, by about from 8 to 10%. Average household income, and would reduce income inequality as captured by Gini index, which is chart number 6 in the slide. Chapter 6, I'm going to go slowly to the end. Chapter 6, it's about the role of social spending in improving socio-economic outcomes in the MENA region. It shows that the level of public social spending in the region remains relatively low relative to other economy, other regions, advanced emerging market and developing economies, which could explain why MENA lags many of these regions in a few socioeconomic indicators, including the human development indicators, which are used in the chapter. The chapters also show that a sustained increase in social protection spending by 10% in MENA would reduce these gaps significantly by 20 to 40%. However, as Said said, the fiscal space is not huge, just to put it mildly. So it may be very difficult for many economies, especially after the pandemic, to engineer that kind of response. It's very important to look at the efficiency of spending, and there's a lot of ground to improve there. This is the chart on the right side of this slide. The efficiency estimation of efficiency frontier show for both health and education show that many economies tend to be below the frontier. So certainly there's a scope to improve the way that public resources are utilized or spent in these two dimensions. Improve the efficiency and targeting of current social spending. Financial inclusion, the chapter 7. It's a chapter that covers a lot on the evolution of financial inclusion in MENA, the macroeconomic benefits of increasing financial inclusion in the MENA regions in terms of jobs, in terms of growth. For example, this chart here, these two charts here show the in a way the cost in terms of growth from limited financial inclusion of small and medium enterprises. The cost of SMEs in MENA falling behind the average in this dimension than other emerging markets. Feel this gaps cost quite a lot for especially for the charts on the slide on the right. Low income, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, about 2-3 percentage points of growth, which is in a way lost because of the limited access to finance by SMEs, and a little bit less for the countries on the left, including Egypt, but still not negligible. And finally, the last chart, climate change. Chapter 8 deals about the impact of climate change. Climate change is not a problem that is going to come. It's the problem of today. And what the chapter does, trying to first assess the impact of this on inclusiveness. The impact is there because, you know, the negative impact of climate change on the economy is likely to be felt even more by the most vulnerable groups in the population. Things about the farmers, everybody who works in the agricultural sector, which is hit by droughts, increasing frequency of droughts. The chart here shows the impact of an increase in temperature by 1 degree Celsius on unemployment, which again, it's about half of a percentage point over the years in the region. Of course, it's a chapter that deals a lot also with the policy implications of this important dimension of the problem. This is all for me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I've took notes and I've highlighted the things in red that I want to reiterate, but my whole screen is in red. So, I mean, staggering information and very shocking information. And I really thank you for this analysis, and thank you for doing it in a very simplified way without all the regressions and all the tables of regressions. But for me, what was really staggering, that numbers in the table that you showed when we relaxed the financial constraint and the public and the product market distortion constraints, and how much they increase the wages, how much they increase the productivity, and just the numbers are really, really shocking, at least to me, in terms of the potential impact, negative impact that these constraints have on our economy. And I really, really loved the slide where you have this menu of recipe to increase the female labor force participation. Just, it's out there in black and white. It's very simple. It's straightforward. And yet I fail to answer the question that all my students ask me every single semester: why hasn't been done? And the fact that the 80% of the gap is just exclusively because of the legal and the financial gap is just makes it purely a policy choice. And the fact that we can increase our GDP by 8.8% from the low income countries by just relaxing these two constraints, again, is very shocking and thought-provoking. And I hope I want to reiterate the point that I'm at least proud that within the walls of AUC, the gender distribution is actually anti-bias men, it's bias for women. So that's at least one source of positive light in the room today. So thank you again, Roberto. I move to Suchanan, who will speak to us again about the role of the private sector. Did I spell that correctly? No, I apologize. I'll send an apology in a full official email. You're muted.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, just 1 second while I'm trying to not block myself. Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be part of today's discussion. So, you know, Roberto has already kind of highlighted all the different chapters in the book, and the topic I am presenting today is the third chapter in the book, which is the fostering private sector-led growth in the Middle East and North Africa, and what that means for the role of the state. So as Sayed highlighted at the beginning, I understand that this is a topic of great interest in the region, including here in Egypt. So let's go ahead and get started. In today's presentation, I will talk briefly about the large footprint of the state in MENA, particularly through the large number of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, in the countries in the region. I will also present to you some empirical evidence. So there'll be some regressions on how SOEs differ from private sector firms and how their presence affects the private sector dynamics. Then it will conclude by discussing the policy implications of our research. As mentioned, today's presentation is based on the book, on a chapter in the book Promoting Inclusive Growth in the Middle East and North Africa, which is available to you on IMF website. So, historically, as you may already know, many MENA countries adopted these development models that are based on what we call state capitalism. This is where the government has directed production, investment, and just general resource allocation. So this approach, was not uncommon all over the world, especially during the post-World War II era. And it reflected a number of considerations, including the fact that often the private sector just simply did not have the ability to mobilize the savings and undertake very large investment projects. But this strategy, of course, led to a large footprint of the state, particularly in the MENA region, as evidenced by the persistently high share of public consumption and public investment, which were often financed by banks, which were themselves owned by the state. So as you can see on the right-hand side chart here, MENA is amongst the regions in the world with very high share of public consumption. The strategy of state-led growth has also led to governments in the region often playing the role of the employers of first and last resort. So what that means is that public sector jobs were often used as a mechanism for wealth redistribution and or social support. So in the wake of the Arab Spring, for example, we saw that wage bills across the MENA region grew extremely rapidly as the governments stepped in to increase public employment as well as compensation. So in the middle chart, you can see that right now, public wage bills in the MENA region are the highest in the world. Of course, state-led capitalism in recent years may be reaching its limits. So when we were looking at long-term growth in the countries across the world, we were quite struck by the decline in the overall productivity in the MENA region in recent years. So if you look at the right-hand side chart, this chart shows total factor productivity growth. And you can see that in most MENA countries, it has been significantly lower than other emerging markets and developing economies over the last decade. In the 5 years pre-COVID, so again, all of our data were up until 2019, so in the pre-COVID years. In the 5 years leading up to COVID, the trend was actually especially pronounced in the region, with productivity declining, not just in the GCC, but also you see in countries like Jordan and Tunisia. Egypt actually was one of the few countries in the region that managed to achieve positive total factor productivity growth during this time. However, just the overall trend seems to suggest that state-led capitalism may be reaching its limits in terms of supporting growth, and a new economic strategy may now be needed. So of course, a key part of the state-led growth strategy in MENA was the creation of state-owned enterprises, which were used to help promote industrial and social policies, manage national assets, as well as to create employment. As a result, of course, the SOE footprint in MENA is on average much larger than in the OECD countries. But of course, as you can see on the left-hand side chart, there are significant differences across the countries in the region. When you look at the share of assets held by SOEs, this is the middle chart, you can also see that the share of assets held by SOEs is higher in MENA than in the rest of the world, with especially high concentration in sectors like mining, ICT, transport, and trade. In Egypt, this is the right-hand side chart. In Egypt, the SOE footprint is not only deep, just in terms of the size, but also it is broad in scope. So you can see that, SOE is present in a wide variety of sectors, from utilities to telecom to transport, and from manufacturing to textile and footwear. What we also see is that SOEs tend to benefit from fiscal and administrative advantages that are provided by the state, which help a lot of these SOEs survive even when some of them were operating at a loss. Many of them benefit from direct fiscal support in the form of budget transfers or on lending from the government, or indirect support from the government in the forms of guarantees, which would lower the cost of their borrowing. So these kinds of supports for loss-making SOEs cut into what is often already a limited fiscal space, as Roberto highlighted earlier. And therefore, once these resources are concentrated into supporting SOEs, that reduces the state's ability to support other social initiatives or other growth-enhancing investments, for example. So then it should not perhaps come as a surprise that the special advantages afforded to SOEs can lead to market distortions and an inefficient allocation of resources in the country. And this is to the detriment of private sector firms. Because after all, just by design, it is not what we call a level playing field to begin with. The problem, of course, is that this can in turn reduce the incentives for the private sector to come in and invest, to enter just into that sector in general. And this leads to reduced business dynamism. It also stifles competition and therefore innovation, because from the beginning, the odds are already stacked against you if you try to enter that sector. So the outcome is actually reflected in how the private sector has evolved in the MENA region. Previous studies have shown that private sector firms in the MENA region are generally smaller. They tend to be fewer in numbers, and they are older than private sector firms in the other regions. So these are just kind of anecdotal evidence that is consistent with the barriers to entering into a sector and also barriers to growing within that sector that are related to resource misallocation. In our study, we tried to understand more empirically the link between private sector development in MENA and the dominance of SOEs in economic activities. So what we did was, we used a panel of firm-level data from Orbis to try to address three main questions. The first is really, how do SOEs differ from private sector firms? Are there quantitative differences that we can see in the data between SOEs and private sector firms? The second question we wanted to address was whether or not SOEs are less productive and less efficient, which, as I said earlier, would suggest a misallocation of resources. We know that there's plenty of anecdotal evidence about how SOEs are not productive and not efficient, but we also wanted to see whether or not that bears out in the data at firm level. The third question is, which I think is the key question, is whether there is any evidence that the SOE presence affects competition, business dynamism, and also just investment in the private sector. So what we find is that, SOEs do differ from private sector firms in several key dimensions. Globally, so when we look at data just across the world, you would see that SOEs on average face lower interest costs than private sector firms. So what that means is that, I mentioned earlier that SOEs benefit from guarantees by the state, which would lower the cost of their operation. And this we see in the data as, the lower cost of borrowing that SOEs face compared to private sector firms from the same country. We also find that, this is in the second column of the regression results, we also find that SOEs are less profitable than private sector firms. The average return on equity is lower across SOEs. And then we also find that in MENA specifically, SOEs are on average less productive than private sector firms. So the way we measure productivity is, looking at the returns on capital. So basically how much companies are able to generate just given the size of their assets. So we find that in the MENA region in particular, SOEs are generally less productive than private sector firms. Now, next, we consider the relationship between the presence of SOEs in a particular sector. So we measure the presence of SOEs by the share of the total assets that SOEs hold in a particular sector. And then we look at how that impacts private sector evolution and dynamics. What we find is that in the output market concentration, so we measure concentration using the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So it just looks at, the number of the largest firms in a particular sector and how large that is. So we do find that output market concentration is higher in sectors with larger SOE presence, which means that there are fewer firms in general that operate in that particular sector. So that suggests lower competition. And we also see that this effect is actually stronger in the MENA region than in the rest of the world, which also suggests that MENA SOEs are associated more strongly with lower competition. This relationship also shows up in the input market concentration. So these are the two right columns. So you can see that, in the bid for capital or in the bid for labor, SOEs also have a stronger bargaining power. So, it goes to the point that Roberto made earlier about how this impedes inclusive growth because SOEs do have market power, they can pay less for capital and be able to compete that away from the market, or pay slightly less for workers and still be able to compete that away from the market. So absent these distortions, we would expect more efficient use of capital and labor and probably higher pay associated with that lack of distortion as well. So, the main question, as I mentioned, is, how does all of this affect the private sector? We do find that larger SOE presence in the sector is associated with lower business dynamism. Okay, so this is, we measure this using entry and exit rates. So looking at, when firms come into our data set and when firms shut down and exit our data set. So, we do find that, as I said, larger SOE presence in a particular sector tends to be associated with lower entry and exit rates within that sector. Perhaps even more importantly, we also find that larger SOE presence is associated with lower private sector investment. So again, this may also just in general explain, the lower level of private sector participation in the MENA region. So, in conclusion, just to summarize the empirical results that I just presented to you, SOEs do differ empirically from private sector firms. They tend to benefit from certain advantages, especially, as I showed you in getting capital at a lower interest cost. They also tend to be less profitable and less productive than private sector firms. And we also find that higher SOE presence in a particular sector is associated with lower competition in both the input and output markets. There's lower business dynamism and also lower private sector investments. So, these empirical findings, just to kind of link it back to policies, right? Our empirical findings kind of confirm the distorted effect of state involvement in the economy, especially on private sector growth and development. So, these would not necessarily come as a surprise, but, while some of these distortions are observed just globally at a global level, in MENA, what is particularly concerning is the fact that, there is just a larger state presence in the MENA region. And so what that means is that, the distortions that you see, just from state-led interventions is just much more pronounced in the MENA region, and it translates into a more substantial effect on private sector inclusion in the MENA region just because of the sheer size of the state in this region. So these results to us point to the need for a broad reform of SOEs within a more general reassessment of the role of the state in the MENA economies. So, I just want to also point out that, this does not mean that the state will not have an important role to play. We saw during the pandemic, for example, that, in countries across the world, sometimes the state is still the best at mobilizing large-scale resources, at mobilizing responses, in a very coordinated way. But, what the empirical evidence on the private sector has told us is that, it may be time for a change in the role of the state, from that of an active player in the economy to that of the facilitator or an enabler, as Sayed calls it, of the private sector development. So, for example, the state could help enforce better governance and transparency for SOEs. It can help incentivize efficiency, greater efficiency in SOEs. The state can also adopt a competition policy framework that ensures competitive neutrality such that SOEs are not, that SOEs do not have an unfair disadvantage and are distorting the market in order, so basically what we want to see is that SOEs are subject to the same rules as the private sector, and that financial support to SOEs are slowly phased out, unless, of course, they are justified by clear economic rationale. You also want to see things like, scaling back the preferential access to inputs for SOEs and allowing the private sector firm to compete in the access to those inputs as well. Now, in Egypt, the policies to support investment and the development of a private, of a vibrant private sector would include things like, Egypt now has a new SOE law, which helps to establish the rules for the creation of new SOEs and enhances the governance of SOEs, including promoting transparency and efficiency of SOEs. So I think the implementation of this law will be extremely important in terms of leveling the playing field for the private sector. One thing that we think will be important for Egypt as well is, to kind of separate the regulator and the market participant functions. So what I mean by that is, there are a lot of ministries that also own SOEs, but those ministries are also the regulators in those markets. So, it is just difficult for those regulators to be completely impartial in their market regulation because they are also active participants in those markets. Another thing that will be important for Egypt, as I showed you earlier, the reach of SOEs in Egypt is not just deep, but it's also broad across so many different sectors, right? So, gradually rationalizing the SOEs through gradual privatization and, perhaps merging or liquidating SOEs that are underperforming, not only scales back the state footprint, but it also frees up resources, fiscal resources that are scarce for more productive use in the economy. And then, lastly, ensuring that the competition policy framework in Egypt applies to SOEs as well as to the private sector firms. Again, this will ensure competitive neutrality between private and public firms. And, I think that, there's work ongoing to develop and enhance the competition policy framework in Egypt. It will be important to not just have the framework de jure, but, to actually use it in practice as well. We actually see in many countries where, the law does apply to both SOEs and the private sector, but when it comes to practice, SOEs still end up benefiting from a lot of advantages that are not underpinned by the law. So the implementation of this framework, it's important to have the policies, but it will be important to have the implementation of these policies as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suchanan. This is quite the way to say this. This is a very rigorous way of validating a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we see in our daily lives in the economy of Egypt. I think putting scientific proof to what we see in the street and putting rigorous evidence to what we know is very, very much needed in terms of evidence. I really love the part, the last two slides that you presented. It shows really a very nice menu. I always, the issue of the state being market participants and the regulator, I always compare it to my students as if, for a football fan like myself, as if you are a player in the team and at the same time you are a referee, which makes really a very difficult situation. And obviously we cannot reiterate for an economy as Egypt, where we have an average increase of 2 million newborn every year and about 1 million entrant to the market. We cannot really re-emphasize the role of non-state actors in absorbing this youth into the labor market. Dr. Ahmed Abu Wahab, you have a lot to comment on. So there is a lot that we've know of, we are aware of the problems that we face in Egypt and in the MENA region. You are one of the industrial leaders of the country. Please tell us your thoughts.
Don't know where to start from, but I'll try. Let me start by saying when Dr. Samer invited me to speak on this subject, I had to give it some thought. Why? I'm the managing director of two companies. One is the East Port Said Development Company, and that's a company that the National Service Projects Organization, part of the armed force, is 48% owner of which. And that company is developing the area in East Port Said on the Suez Canal. And the other company that I manage is the National Egyptian Railway Industries Company. And that company has the Suez Canal Economic Zone as well as the Sovereign Fund of Egypt as shareholders, and they own another 48%. So I had to give it some thought, and I decided that I'm well suited to talk about it, because on one way I can see the balance of two sides. On the side of East Port Said and NERIC, these two companies are developmental companies developing areas, or the first one developing an area which the private sector is not developing and will not have an appetite to develop for the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years due to security issues in Sinai. That that industrial zone is in Sinai. NERIC is the first entrant into the manufacture of rolling stock, competing with CIMAF, which is part of the Arab Organization for Industrialization, something that I have to say it was a very tough battle to establish that company, because AOI put its foot down and said, we're not going to see this happen. But at the end of the day, I have to say that the Minister of Transport was adamant about the formation of this company. Now, I have to say that in both companies, the private sector is managing. So I'm managing and I represent the private sector. The private sector are companies that have been established and working in the private sector for many years. One good thing about this is to ensure alignment of the national interests as well as the private sector interest, and bring in efficiency into the management of these companies. Now, with that introduction, let me move on to the negatives, if I may say it this way. I sat on the board of the Egyptian Competition Authority for 10 years. And we've always had an issue with what was raised regarding the regulation vis-a-vis the operation. And we have seen in sectors like communication, electricity, even industrial real estate, you have the government regulating and facilitating on one hand, but it is operating. So the governance is a very big question mark. The Prime Minister, in his address yesterday in the press conference that he did after the meeting of the Supreme Council for Investment, mentioned that that is going to be addressed, and I hope that it is addressed. Now, let me backtrack and say, where are we? Is there any question in anyone's mind that the intervention of the state in a big way has a negative impact on the dynamism of the private sector? There's no question in my mind whatsoever. The question is how to go about it. And I think this is where Egypt's biggest problem is how to implement. I would like to think that the document that came out, actually the dialogue that started in May of last year, and the document that was endorsed by the president on the 29th of December of 2022 for state ownership policy, I'd like to think that it has good intentions behind it. But the implementation is an extremely tough thing to do. Why is it extremely tough? The government stepped in and intervened in the economy for many years, but increased its intervention starting 2013. And we've seen, as what has been presented, depth and diversity in many sectors. Now, once you've done that, there are lots of interests that have been generated. And to take away these interests is an extremely difficult thing to do. I can see it, and I see it in even what they're trying to push, but there is a negative push from the other side. And I personally think that with all the good intentions, it will take literally, even though the policy talks about 3 to 5 years to come out of some of the sectors, I would like to think it's not 3 or 5 years. It really is going to be tens of years, and I hate to say it this way, but that is one of my biggest concerns. The other concern that I have, which relates to this government intervention, the ministries, unlike the GCC, I'm not sure that the government pays well. If you work in any of the ministries, you're not going to be paid well. And what happens is you get mediocre people working in the government. The impact of this is that you have very poor policy formulation and policy setting in the government. You do not have counterparts. I see this very well in the field of industrial policy. We do not have a counterpart. The private sector does not have a counterpart. And is the solution that the government would go in and invest? That is definitely not the solution. So something has to be done to make sure that top talent goes into the government. We see this happening now in the GCC. You have top talent being attracted by the government, working for the government, and hence very good policy formulation and implementation. Let me go back to the state ownership policy. Now, I've read the policy very carefully. The one thing that is not answered in this policy is the vagueness of what constitutes the area of security. What are security? Is the manufacture of potatoes a security issue? Could be, I don't know. but someone needs to, as it was dissected, there was very clear demarcation of what the government is going to come out of, where it will reduce its investment and where it will increase its investment. And I can see things like health and education, and yes, I can see these things. But the one statement that is not clear is what constitutes security sectors that the government should stay in or increase its presence in. I think that's enough.
That's short and sweet. So, so I fully agree with you. I've read the document many times. Dr. Ahmed, Abdel and myself are referring to the document that I think every single student in this room should read and memorize. It's a document that reflects in black and white, yet vaguely, the role of the state in the economy. So it has, as Dr. Wahab rightly pointed out, several mentions of the word national security. So I think for you students, I think a very good research topic for you is potatoes manufacturing an issue of national security or not? And that, I think, is an answer that we're expecting to hear. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. I think you've entitled really areas where the government intervention is useful, areas where the government intervention is not. Thank you, really. I could not think of anyone else who could really give insights on actually what's happening on the ground vis-a-vis the challenges that are facing the private sector. I think we started a bit late, but I want to really give the floor to the main protagonist in this event, which is the students and the young people. So the floor is yours. There are a lot of challenges, and I think we count on you to sort it out in the near future. So question, remarks? Mariam Diab. I'm just making sure I remember your name, that's all. You don't have to. Nadine? And please introduce yourself, because you may or may not be selected for the IMF youth. Her name is Nadine. So, and please tell us who you're addressing the question to.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Nadine Wael. I'm an undergrad student, double majoring in business and economics. And my question is about like we know that one of the problems now is the entrenched interests that we have for the state-owned enterprises. But like, what are some of the solutions or the pathways that we can look into in order to try to like shorten the period of time that it might take to like remove these conflicts of interests, and what are the solutions that are on the table to try to solve that problem?
Maybe we'll take a couple of more questions and then just to give you time to think of the answer. Yes. No, we need it so that people can.
Noha Omar from the business school economics department. I have actually two questions, and they are for the IMF team. The first question is that you mentioned different concepts like the inclusive index, inclusive growth index, the basic legal rights for women, and many others, but without a definition. So for instance, yes, for the index, we know the different dimensions, but what are the variables included and how we computed the index? Maybe this was a little bit biased for one aspect rather than the other. So here the MENA wasn't very much presented in this index. Secondly, for the basic legal rights for women, I think it's very important to show us what's the definition behind this concept. And thirdly, you mentioned different regression. This is very important scientifically. And I found different values that are statistically significant, but actually meaningful, they are not significant enough. And for instance, For the SOE share in output market, it was just 0.095, which is, yes, statistically significant, perfect, but practically, this is not that much important, I think. So it's really important also when we run such tests to care about the real meaning practically, not just statistically. Another thing, I believe that inclusive growth is really important over the world, especially in these times, so to have a better living standard and everything. But I had, like, amazed a little bit, confusion. And you mentioned automation, and we are in the AI era, and this will lead to unemployment to increase for low and medium skills labor, and we're looking for inclusive growth. So how growth will be trickled down to those people who are not working anymore? So are we looking for cash transfers? So we're not talking about growth anymore. So it's a little bit confusing for me. So if you can just explain it a little bit.
Thank you, Noha. Very, very points. Any other questions from the students?
Okay, so one more question.
Yes, go for it, Noha.
For the SOE, the state-owned.
Yeah.
Did you count for the army, because they are mainly the
military institution? Yeah.
Yes.
Very good question. Good. Question from the students. You have a chance to go to Marrakesh, so the more you shine and ask smart questions, go for it, MENA. Wait for the mic, MENA, please.
My name is MENA. I'm a senior economics major. My question is, we talked about the negative implications of SOEs and its impact on competition and dynamism. But however, what are the negative impacts of privatization as well? Like increasing crony capitalism, for example, and especially that there is this small segment in the Egyptian polity that controls many of the big enterprises, private enterprises. So I guess the privatization as well can have possible very significant negative impacts on competition as well.
Thank you. Yeah, especially with the case of crony capitalism. Spot on. Thank you. Maybe we'll answer these first, and then Dr. Abu Wahab, how can we shorten the time? But not shorten the time of your answer.
That's really a very difficult one, Nadine. The document is clear, but I think what is missing is to see how the program is going to be done, even the 30 plus that they said that they will dispose of in the next few months. I still do not see how they're going to do this and what are the KPIs, how are we progressing? We just hear snippets of information. So you really need to have a clear plan and share the plan with the outside world and let the people see. 3 to 5 years. What is 3 to 5 years? What's the program behind this? That's not clear. One other issue that we have not talked about, we need to settle the foreign exchange issue. Without this, you really, it's extremely difficult to get an investor to come and invest and not know what the value of his investment is going to be tomorrow or the day after. So you really need, that needs immediate attention, needs to be resolved. Without that, we're just wasting the time. And actually, there is a very big cost that is being paid for not resolving this issue. Factories, in the meantime, are closing and having to wait for weeks to get raw materials. So it is a very grave situation, very difficult one. Without resolving that issue, I don't think we're going to be able to move forward quickly. That's the best I can do on this.
Thank you. So, Roberto and Suchanan, we have a lot of methodological questions. I wrote them down just for you. So the definition of inclusive, what is the basic legal rights, some of the variables are statistically significant but not important. How can you reconcile the automation versus inclusive growth, and whether or not the SOEs include enterprises owned by the military? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. So I'll leave it.
I'll answer the ones on...
A lot of these answers are in the book, but maybe you can shed light quickly on them, Roberto.
Yeah, absolutely. So on automation and inclusiveness, well, I mean, the link between the two is exactly the fact that automation, in the short run, maybe in the long run is a little bit of, of a different story as usually when it comes to technological progress, but in the short run may hit a series of jobs that are low-skill jobs. And that may have implications on at least one dimension of inclusiveness, which is the first one, benefit sharing, income inequality, if you want. It may restrict also the other dimension, may hit the other dimension of inclusion, which is participation. So a few jobs, as the economy adjusts to the shock, as new jobs are created, and hopefully this is there's a huge discussion about this that of course I'm not gonna touch now, but there's a huge discussion on the short run impact of this on jobs. And again, the jobs that are at risk are especially the low-skill jobs that tends to be concentrated among the lowest segment of the income distribution. So there is clearly an inclusiveness dimension to it, both on the income inequality and on the participation side of inclusion. But the chapter has also a positive message, which is the remote working. The remote working is actually more of an opportunity, especially for women, for young. There's new jobs, there's more flexibility associated with that. Think about women who can actually work from home. One dimension of the low labor force participation of women in the region is, for example, transportation, the need for secure, even subsidized, if you want, transportation. Women tend to use more public transportation to go to work. So in that sense, remote working may be an opportunity for those who are mainly excluded from the labor market in the region, which are women and young. It kind of adds flexibility that women may need in order to combine their role in the household and their participation to work. For that to happen, you need to have investment in infrastructure, in information and communication infrastructure. If you read the chapter, Eva, you will see that the countries that have more invested in information and communication technology are also the ones that are more capable of reaping the benefit of remote working. So there's the negative, if you want, at least in the short run. The long run, it's maybe a different story, but also some positive from the remote working story. In terms of labor market participation of women, what's basic rights? Again, you're invited to read the chapter. There's an annex that shows exactly how that dimension is captured. There are basic variables, like if a woman can apply for a passport in the same way as a man, if a woman can travel outside the country in the same way as a man. These are all variables from the World Bank, Women, Business, and the Law database. Now, these are significant restrictions to mobility, I'll say, to participation, to life, to take economic out of the phrase. And for me, it's obvious that these variables have to have an important role in any regression environment. That doesn't mean that there's no other, and these variables capture, all these legal financial restrictions that don't fall from the sky. These are a way to portray, to assess, to quantify the social norm, what we call the social norm, no? Which is normally residual in this kind of regression. And you can't try to capture for everything the policy can control, and then what you don't find, okay, that's the social norm. This is a way of capturing the social norm, if you want. Again, this legislation doesn't come from Mars or from Venus. It comes from the social norm. But that doesn't mean that and it's going to take time to change the social norm. Nobody, of course, has an illusion that this is going to happen over time. As the professor said, you're going to have to be the one who change that gradually over time. But there's things that policies maker can do today, and they may be less represented in the regression, but they're still important, like childcare. I mean, of course, childcare is important. And there are countries where childcare is completely private. There's no public childcare. I mean, so the country I'm working now around at the moment, Morocco has a huge program a large program of construction of public childcare to give women the possibility of working. The tax code may be an impediment for second earner in the household, not necessarily a woman. Second earner can be a man in some cases, and can be an impediment to participate in the labor market. I mean, essentially, you pay taxes and you don't get the benefits because the benefits are already accrued by the first earner in the household. So you may think about changing the tax code in order to incentivize the participation to labor for the second earner in the family, which normally is a woman in many countries, not just in the MENA. Think about the labor code, the extent to which it restricts labor flexibility, part-time, and restrict the possibility of women to participate into the labor market, transportation, public transportation. So all these variables, it's true that the regression says they're not important, but again, that doesn't mean they're not important. I think this is actually the variables that policymakers can control today to at least create the dimension, the environment that are more conducive, that creates the possibility for women to participate to work. And for that to happen, you need also the social norm to go over, the social norm dimension, which again is something that policymakers can do less about. And it's something that is going to come with time. I don't know whether I answered this question, but I guess, I mean, if you read the chapters, are going to be, it's going to be clearer what we do in these dimensions.
Thank you, Roberto. There was a question about the military. I presume they are included in the state-owned enterprises based conditional on data availability, I presume.
Yes, so let me come in there, Dr. Samir. So I mean, just to respond to a couple of the questions that that Noha raised. So, for example, on the size of the coefficients that we see in our studies. So you know, I think you're right that like we don't just pay attention to the statistical significance of our regressions, right? We also want to look at what that coefficient means. In the particular example that you cited, which is like the 0.095, that one is actually on the market concentration. So the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is actually out of 1. So I mean, I know that the number looks small, but basically 0.095 means that lowering the SOE share in that sector by 1% lowers the output market concentration by 9.5%. So in that particular index, the number may look small, but since it is out of 1, which is complete monopoly, this is actually does have significant value in lowering the market concentration. I will echo your concern in some of the other variables that we did look at. For example, in the lower interest cost that SOEs face, we were quite surprised actually that was about 0.3 percentage point. So basically what that means is that SOEs in general, on average, face lower interest cost by only 0.3 percentage points. So what that means is that in an investment of $1 million, for example, the SOE would only pay lower interest by $3,000. So that to us was quite surprising because we would have thought that the effect would have been much bigger. Again, it is statistically significant, but when you translate it to actual numbers, I mean, we were quite surprised to see why that was so low. Of course, you need to think about the other non-monetary and non-financial benefits that SOEs are able to benefit from as well, right? So we do see this in the interest cost, but SOEs, as we know, also benefit from the ability to circumvent red tape. They may have first priority in terms of bidding for certain pieces of land, certain pieces of assets. They may have better access in general, which won't show up as interest cost, but that doesn't mean that those advantages don't exist. But, point very well taken. And, that is something that we do consider after looking at the regressions. We do try to understand what it means in real terms, if you will. There was also a question about whether or not our study includes military-owned enterprises. This is a firm-level data, and it is self-reported in terms of, so the state-owned enterprises are identified by, firms that are more than 50% owned by public authority, the state, or the central government. So my guess is that military-owned enterprises would generally not respond to the survey. If they do, they would show up as, as being a state-owned enterprises. But again, my guess is that they would not necessarily respond to surveys of this type because of security reasons and whatnot. There was one question about the potential negative impact of privatization. I think that is an extremely important question. So again, I just want to highlight that, like the IMF and I think just any institution in general, we don't view privatization as a panacea, right? It is also about how the privatization is done. So, if it is done in a way that, the crony capitalists are the ones that benefit from that state divestiture, obviously you're just transferring, power from one group of people to another group of people without really benefiting the state or the labor market. So, the way that you want to think about privatization in these recommendations is really how to do it competitively, how to do it transparently. So, it comes hand in hand with reforms in other areas such as, procurement or, competitive bidding, just more accountability in that framework in general and not about transferring, the market power from the hands of the state to friends of the state, if you will. But that's it from me. If I missed anything, please let me know.
Thank you. So we'll have maybe a handful of minutes for another round of questions. Mariam Dia, what is the mic? No, but they need to hear it in the. They need to hear it in the virtual room.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I actually have two questions. I hope they're not going to be too long to answer. The first one actually builds on the last point that we were talking about, in building on Dr. Noha's point and MENA's points in terms of increased unemployment resulting from increased automation and private sector empowerment. We're looking at potential expansion of the informal sector. So which is actually counterproductive to the development goals of Egypt. So what are the different policies that the government of Egypt can maybe implement to kind of at least contain that? That's for the first question. And the second question, in the spirit of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and in accordance with our topic today in terms of inclusivity, what are the prospects of ensuring inclusivity for other governorates in Egypt that are far behind, such as Upper Egypt, for example? How can we ensure that they are not left behind in all of our plans for the future?
Thank you, Mariam. This is another session to answer these questions. So, any other questions from our guests? Yes, please. Can you pass the mic, Mariam, please? Can you please introduce yourself? Yeah,
I'm Abdel Hisham, a business student concentrating in entrepreneurship. So I was very interested in your talk. Thank you very much for your words. My question was mainly related to privatization and state-owned enterprises. So when I was thinking about it, I thought more about like private-public partnerships. So my question was more related to that fact that would you think that private-public partnerships would perhaps make it more than to have the economy as a privatized economy? So we can see actually that example in Morocco, which is related to the automotive industry. It's already booming fastly and it's growing rapidly. Perhaps it's considered as the best country in the region to export now cars, and it's mainly done by the partnership of the two only sectors, the public sector and the private sector. So would you think that actually a partnership between both sectors in Egypt would solve the conflict instead of having like the privatization concept? Thank you.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. Very good questions. Actually, we'll start with you and address it to Dr. Wahab.
That's an excellent question. Actually, it touches on a few things that I've been talking about. One, the private-public partnership is part of the policy document that was issued. And the two examples that I gave you, the two companies that I manage, Eastport Said and NEREC, are both partnerships in the sense that, as I said, 48% are state-owned and 52% is private sector. Management is with the private sector. The role of the state in this case is to facilitate things that are in a way related to this region and the fact that it is in Sinai and security and what have you. So that's part of it. Preceding this private-public partnership, you really have to have an overall vision of where you want to go. I work in the automotive field, and I witnessed what has happened in Morocco from its start in 2006, 2007, visited the Tanja free zone area in 2010, but it was all about a leader who had a vision for the country and selection of industries that can pull lots of industries in feeding industries and what have you, so that they can have a spillover effect in technology. When we talked, I'll go back to the question that I think Noha asked this question about the AI and its impact. What has always been happening is whenever there are new technologies, people learn how to do them. There is a time lag, maybe generation lag in some cases. But with the selection of the automotive, and by the way, they have also aerospace because they've focused on those two industries, you build a knowledge base that enables you to deal with newer technologies. So it's all about having a vision that leads this and brings me back to the government and policy formulation and industrial policy, which we are lacking. And so the big question is, okay, we privatize these things, but do we have a vision? Do we have a theme that we're trying to, when you talked about Morocco, everyone in this room knows what it has done in the automotive domain, and some of us know what they've been doing in the aerospace domain. Yesterday or the day before, the King showed their new EV. So it's about a vision. Enough said.
Thank you. Very clear. Back to the two very long questions to Mariam. So I don't expect you to answer them in detail, but can you please, based on what is in the book, try to show or highlight quickly where Mariam can find answers in the book about her two questions. So one of them is about the second one was about inclusive in remote areas in countries like Egypt, but also not only Egypt, but a lot of countries in the MENA region. The other one was about the automation and the private sector and the role of the informal sector and how can it affect that? How does the automation affect that?
Well, I mean, more than responding, citing this book, I can respond citing another paper that we at the IMF published last year on informality in North Africa. It was a departmental paper that covered essentially Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt. We presented it in last June, so it's on our website. Informality is a huge issue. It affects inclusiveness because of the quality of jobs, affect the budget, the fiscal dimension of it, and it's a very complicated area. I mean, there's a need for a lot of policies. But the main point that the paper does make is informality is not necessarily though a bad thing. I mean, there's informality which it's a buffer when you have the negative parts of the economic cycle. There's people whose productivity, human skills, it's low, so low that you can never include them. You can never essentially ask them to contribute to paying taxes and social contributions. I mean, and for them, informality is a better option than just not working at all. Okay, so there's a limit to which you can think about informality. It can be resolved by policy. Informality is very much a dimension of the level of development of a country. So you can actually reduce it over time just by improving the quality of the human capital, productivity, reforms that take the country from one level of income to another level of income. That informality, though there's no way you can resolve with policy measures. Then there's the informality, which is actually comes from distortions. The distortions that we kind of addressed in chapter 2 of this economy. Excessive government regulation, excessive taxation, all that red tape that forces people, the people who can actually choose or who have the choice between being informal and formal. And again, they are not all the people, because for a big chunk of the population in MENA, informality is it's not a choice. It's not an option. Either you're informal or you don't work, period. But then there's the section of the economy for which informality or formality is a choice. It depends on how much taxes you pay. It depends on the services that you get by becoming formal. And that is where the policymakers should actually act. I'm sorry, I need to go. I have a very important meeting at 10. So this has been great. And I really encourage you to read the book. And if you have any questions, you know where you can find me. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Roberto. Actually, concluding, thank you so much, Roberto and Suchanan, for your time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Dr. Wahab, for your time and coming here and your useful insights. Thank you all. And for the students, you have 2 weeks of stressful times and coffee, so make sure to do well in your exam. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for a great event. Bye.